My husband wasn't cold in the ground yet when his son handed me a business card for a moving company. 30 days, Richard said, sitting at my kitchen table like he owned it, which, I suppose, he'd been waiting 18 years to do. That's more than fair, Dorothy. Diane stood behind him and didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The look on her face said everything she'd been keeping polished and quiet for nearly 2 decades. I picked up that business card, looked at it, set it back down. All right, I said. They thought that was surrender. They thought a 69-year-old widow with nowhere to go had just made their lives very simple. I let them think that, the same way I'd let them think a lot of things over 18 years. Because some corrections aren't worth making out loud, and some people need to drive up a gravel road and see it with their own eyes before they'll believe it anyway. 31 days later, Richard's car turned onto that gravel road. And I was already sitting on the porch, sweet tea in hand, watching his face through the windshield do something I'd waited a long time to see. If you've ever been handed a moving company's card by someone who had no idea what they were actually dealing with, you're going to feel every word of this one, so stay with me, subscribe if you're new, and tell me in the comments. How long would you have waited before you said something? The thing about being the second wife is that you spend the rest of your marriage proving you're not what everyone already decided you were before you walked through the door. I understood that going in. Edward had told me, early on, with the particular honesty of a man who'd learned the hard way that transparency was cheaper than surprises. My kids are going to be difficult, Dot. I love them, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but they're going to be difficult. I told him I could handle difficult. I'd handled difficult my entire life. I just hadn't anticipated quite what kind of difficult he meant. I met Edward Calloway at a Preservation Society meeting in downtown Savannah in the fall of 2004. He was 61, recently widowed, the kind of man who filled a room without trying to, not loud, not showy, just solidly, quietly present in a way that made everything around him feel slightly more grounded. He was on the Society's board of directors. I was there because Wisteria House, the property my grandmother had left me, had just been nominated for the National Historic Register, and I needed to understand what that meant practically before I signed anything. We talked for 40 minutes at the refreshment table after the main presentation about historic preservation and dry rot and the particular challenges of maintaining a 19th century foundation in coastal Georgia's humidity. And by the end of it, he'd asked if he could take me to dinner the following Saturday. I said yes, because he was interesting, and because I'd spent the 4 years since my first husband's death being careful about everything, and I was tired of being careful. We dated for 2 years before we married, which I think surprised people who assumed I was in a hurry. I wasn't. I had my own life, my own property, my own finances. I wasn't looking for a rescue, and Edward, who understood that about me almost immediately and seemed to find it more appealing than threatening, wasn't offering one. What we were looking for, both of us, was simply good company for the years we had left, and the particular comfort of building a life alongside someone who actually saw you clearly. He saw me clearly from the beginning, Edward did. That was the thing I loved most about him, and the thing I miss most now. On our third date, I told him about Wisteria House. Not the full story, not the history and the scale, and what it had meant to my family for 140 years, but enough. Enough for him to understand that I had a life that predated him by a considerable margin, and that I intended to keep it. He didn't ask more than I offered. He just said, very simply, "I'd like to see it someday when you're ready," and moved on in the way of a man comfortable enough in himself to let other people be comfortable in themselves too. I took him to Wisteria House 6 months before we married, on a clear October afternoon when the light came through the old live oaks the way it always did that time of year, turning everything gold and slightly unreal. He stood on the front porch for a long time without saying anything, looking out over the grounds, and then he turned to me with an expression I recognized. The look of someone recalibrating a picture they thought they already had. "Dorothy," he said, "I think there are things about you I'm going to spend a very long time finding out." "Probably," I agreed. He smiled and took my hand, and we walked through the front door together for the first time. I want to be honest about those 18 years, because they were genuinely good ones. Not uncomplicated, not without their difficulties, but good in the way that actually matters, the way built on two people choosing each other consistently, rather than simply coexisting inside an arrangement. Edward was a good husband, and I was a good wife to him, and I don't need anyone's validation of that, least of all his children's. But I also want to be honest about what those 18 years cost me, in terms of the energy I spent trying to be acceptable to two people who had decided, before I'd unpacked my first box, exactly what I was and exactly what I wanted from their father. Richard had his mother's eyes and his mother's particular talent for delivering a verdict, while appearing to simply make an observation. He was cordial to me, always. Never openly rude, never anything I could point to as outright hostility. Just consistently, precisely distant, in the way of someone maintaining a professional relationship, rather than a family one. He called me Dorothy, never anything warmer for 18 years. Diane was more complicated, and in some ways harder. She had moments of genuine warmth, a spontaneous hug at Christmas one year that surprised us both, a phone call once when she'd had a hard week and needed to talk to someone who'd known her father longer than her husband had. Those moments made the other ones harder, because they showed me the person she could have been toward me if she'd decided to let herself. But mostly, Diane and Richard operated as a unit, a closed system with its own internal logic that I was never quite invited to understand, and that logic had at its center one consistent unspoken belief: that I was a placeholder, that their father had made a late-life mistake, understandable in a lonely widower, that they were graciously tolerating until it resolved itself. Edward knew. We talked about it, carefully and honestly, more than once. He'd tried, over the years, to bridge the distance. Family dinners, shared holidays, conversations with each of them that he never quite told me the details of, but that clearly cost him something. "They'll come around," he said more than once, in the tone of a man who needed to believe that, rather than one who actually did. They didn't come around. And then he was gone, and there was no one left to try anymore. And Richard was sitting at my kitchen table with a business card for a moving company, and the quiet, settled look of a man who'd been waiting a long time to sit exactly where he was sitting. What he didn't know, setting that card down on my kitchen table, was that the woman sitting across from him had spent 18 years being exactly as patient as he had. And that patience, it turned out, was about to look very different from the outside of a certain gravel driveway than it had from the inside of his father's house. There's a particular kind of cruelty that never raises its voice, and I think it's the hardest kind to explain to people who haven't experienced it firsthand. It doesn't leave marks. It doesn't give you anything clean enough to point to and say, there, that's the thing, that's what they did. It operates entirely in the space between what's said and what's meant, in the careful architecture of exclusions so small that each one examined individually could be explained away as an oversight, a misunderstanding, a simple difference in how families do things. It's only when you step back and look at 18 years of them lined up together that the pattern becomes undeniable. Richard established the terms in the first month of our marriage, so smoothly and so early that I almost didn't notice he was establishing them at all. It started with the family photographs. Edward and his first wife, Margaret, had a particular way of displaying family photos in the house. Chronological, comprehensive, covering the full wall of the upstairs hallway. After our wedding, Edward wanted to add our photos to that wall and did, a small cluster near the end of the timeline. Within 3 months of our marriage, during a weekend visit, Richard had quietly rearranged the hallway display while Edward and I were out at dinner. Our photos moved to a single frame in the guest bedroom, the wall restored to its previous configuration. Edward mentioned it to Richard. Richard said he'd simply been organizing and hadn't realized it would matter. The photos stayed in the guest bedroom. Diane's contributions were different in texture, but identical in intent. She had a gift for the loaded compliment, the kind that sounds warm on the surface and lands, to the recipient, like a small, precisely aimed dart. "Dorothy, you're so practical about things," she said once, at a family Easter, in a tone that made practical sound like the consolation prize you give someone who fell short of something better. Edward always needed someone grounded. Margaret was. She had a lot of feelings about everything. It must be a relief for him, having someone more even-keeled. I smiled and thanked her for the potato salad she'd brought, which was, objectively, excellent. The money conversations started about 3 years into the marriage, once Richard had apparently decided that a direct approach was worth trying. He took Edward to lunch, without me, which was itself a statement, and came back with a proposal that Edward described to me that evening with the careful, slightly exhausted tone of a man who'd spent 2 hours being managed by his own child. Richard wanted Edward to establish a family trust that would, in the event of Edward's death, transfer the primary assets, the house, the investment accounts, the business interests, directly to Richard and Diane, with a modest, living stipend for me until I either remarried or died. The stipend number Richard had proposed was, Edward said, enough to be technically adequate and insufficient enough to be insulting, which suggested Richard had thought about it carefully. Edward declined. He was very clear about it, he told me, and very specific about why. Richard received this with the polished graciousness of a man who understood that the conversation wasn't over, just postponed. It was never over, not really, in the 18 years that followed. It simply went underground, surfacing periodically in different forms. A comment here, a document there, a suggestion that Edward really should get his affairs in order, delivered with the concerned tone of a loving son, rather than the calculating tone of a man already counting something that wasn't yet his. I watched all of it. I said very little. Edward handled his children the way he handled most difficult things, directly, firmly, without drama, and with a patience I found both admirable and, sometimes quietly, exhausting. "Why don't you ever say anything to them?" Edward asked me once, after a particularly pointed family dinner during which Diane had managed, 3 separate times, to refer to the house as Dad's house, in conversations that included me. "Because anything I say confirms what they already think," I told him. "That I'm defensive about my position here. That I'm worried about what they think of me. That I need to argue for my own legitimacy." I looked at him steadily. "I don't need to argue for it, Edward. You and I know what this marriage is. Their opinion of it isn't the one that matters." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've thought about many times since. "You're the most self-possessed person I've ever known, Dorothy." I think that's what they can't forgive. I think he was right. I think, looking back across 18 years, that the thing Richard and Diane found most fundamentally unsettling about me wasn't that I'd married their father, or that I might inherit something they felt was theirs, or even that I'd successfully occupied a space in Edward's life that they'd hoped would remain empty after their mother died. It was that I never seemed to need their approval. And people who need to be needed find that kind of self-sufficiency almost impossible to forgive. The last real conversation I had with Richard before Edward's death happened about 4 months before the stroke. A Sunday afternoon visit during which Edward had fallen asleep in his chair after lunch, the way he'd been doing more frequently that year, and Richard and I had sat in the living room in the particular uncomfortable quiet of two people who had nothing to say to each other, and both knew it. "You've had a good run here," Richard said finally, in a tone so casual it took me a full second to understand what he'd actually said. I looked at him across the coffee table, at his father's eyes, in a face that had never learned his father's warmth, and I made a decision in that moment that I'd been circling for 18 years. "Richard," I said, matching his casual tone exactly, "I've had a good marriage, to a man I loved and who loved me, in a home we built together. That's not a run, that's a life. I picked up my teacup. I hope you find one someday." He didn't answer. Edward stirred in his chair, and the conversation ended the way most of our conversations ended, not resolved, just finished, set aside until the next time. 4 months later, Edward was gone. And 3 days after that, Richard was back at that same coffee table with a business card, and 30 days, and the quiet, settled certainty of a man who had finally, after 18 years of waiting, gotten exactly where he intended to be. What he still hadn't figured out, sitting there with his hands folded and his voice perfectly level, was that the woman across the table had been exactly where she intended to be the entire time. Edward died on a Thursday morning in late October, in the bedroom we'd shared for 18 years, with the windows open the way he'd always preferred them, and the sound of the garden coming in on the breeze. I was with him. I want to say that simply, without elaboration, because I think it's the most important thing about those final hours. That he wasn't alone, that someone who loved him was there, that the last thing he heard was a voice he knew. That matters, I've come to believe, more than almost anything else about a life. Not how it's built, not what it accumulates, but who's there at the end of it. Richard and Diane arrived within 2 hours. They were efficient in their grief, which I don't say as a criticism. People's process loss differently, and efficiency is its own kind of coping. They made calls, coordinated with the funeral home, handled the immediate logistics with the practiced competence of 2 people who'd done this once before and knew the sequence. I sat in the kitchen and drank tea and let them work, because it was what they needed, and because I had my own grief to sit with, and it didn't require an audience. The funeral was 4 days later at St. John's Episcopal, the church Edward's family had attended for 3 generations. It was beautiful, in the particular way of Savannah funerals, heavy with flowers, full of people who'd known Edward in chapters of his life I'd never been part of. The kind of service that reminds you how much of a person exists outside the portion of them you were given to know. Richard delivered the eulogy. It was well written, genuinely moving in places, and mentioned me once in passing in a subordinate clause near the end, and in his later years, the companionship of his wife Dorothy, with the careful minimalism of a man who'd thought about exactly how much space I deserved in the official account of his father's life, and measured it precisely. I sat in the front pew and looked at Edward's photograph on the order of service and thought about 37 things that had nothing to do with Richard's eulogy. The house afterward, the reception, the food that people brought, the steady stream of condolences from friends and colleagues and neighbors passed the way those things do, in a blur of faces and repeated sentences, and the particular exhaustion of performing composure for hours at a stretch, while something enormous and irreversible settles itself into the permanent architecture of your life. By 8 o'clock, when the last guests had gone, and Diane was loading the dishwasher with the brisk efficiency of someone wrapping up a task, rather than the end of her father's funeral, Richard came and sat across from me at the kitchen table. He had the business card ready. I've thought about that detail often since, that he'd brought it with him, that he'd had it in his jacket pocket during the funeral, during the reception, during all of it. He set it on the table between us with the careful deliberateness of a man who'd rehearsed the gesture. "I know this isn't easy timing," he said, in the tone of someone who found the timing perfectly acceptable. "But I think it's better to be clear now rather than let things get complicated." "What things?" I asked. "The house," he said. "Dad's estate is going to take some time to settle, but the house itself, it came to Diane and me, Dorothy. You know that. We've been patient, and I want to be fair about this, but it's time to start thinking about transition." Diane had stopped loading the dishwasher. She was standing at the counter with a serving dish in her hands, not moving, listening without appearing to listen. "How much time?" I asked. 30 days is reasonable," Richard said. "More than reasonable, actually. And I've taken the liberty of putting together some information on suitable properties in the area, places that would be." He paused, choosing the word with the precision he always brought to these moments. "Appropriate for your situation." I looked at the business card. I looked at Richard's folded hands. I looked at Diane's careful stillness at the counter. I thought about Edward sleeping in his chair 4 months ago, and about the thing Richard had said in the quiet of the living room while his father slept. "You've had a good run here." I thought about 18 years of Sunday dinners and rearranged photographs and subordinate clauses in eulogies. I thought about a house in my family for 140 years, sitting at the end of a gravel drive 40 minutes from where I was sitting, that neither of the people in this kitchen had ever known existed. 30 days, I said. "I think that's fair," Richard said, visibly relieved that there was no scene, no tears, no argument, the messy inconvenience of a widow who didn't know her place. "All right," I said. I stood up, picked up the business card, and carried it to the recycling bin beside the refrigerator. The one Edward had installed the year we'd decided to be more careful about waste, and dropped it in. Richard watched me do this. I turned back to face him, and I made sure I had his full attention before I spoke. "I won't be needing that," I said. "I have somewhere to go. I've always had somewhere to go." I picked up my teacup and carried it to the sink. "Thank you for being clear, Richard. I'll be out in 30 days. I went upstairs to our bedroom. My bedroom, for 29 more days, and I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let myself cry, finally, without performing anything for anyone. Not because of the house. Not because of Richard and his business card and his 30 days. Because of the sound of the garden coming through the window that morning, and the hand I'd been holding when it went still, and the particular, irreplaceable weight of a person who had seen me clearly for 18 years and was no longer there to do it. That was what I was grieving. The rest of it, Richard, Diane, the house, all of it, was simply what came next. And what came next, I already knew, was going to look considerably different from anything either of them had planned for. I packed in the mornings, when the house was quiet and Richard and Diane were at the estate attorney's office, doing the things that needed doing with Edward's affairs. I didn't pack everything. Some things I left deliberately, not because I forgot them, but because I understood, somewhere in the practical, clear-eyed part of myself, that grief hadn't reached yet. That there would be a conversation later about what was mine and what wasn't. And I didn't want to give either of them a reason to have that conversation on unfavorable terms. I took my clothes, my books, the particular kitchen things I'd brought into the marriage, and could document as mine. The photographs of Edward and me that lived in our bedroom rather than the contested hallway, and the small wooden box my grandmother had given me the year before she died that contained nothing valuable to anyone but me. I left the furniture, the art Edward and I had chosen together, the garden tools we'd shared for 18 years. I left the kitchen table where Richard had set down his business card. I left the bedroom curtains I'd ordered from a catalog in 2009 and waited 6 weeks for, because they were the exact shade of blue that made the morning light in that room do something particular, and because leaving them felt, in some way I couldn't entirely explain, like leaving that light behind where it belonged. On the 29th day, I loaded the last boxes into my car myself, because the one thing I'd been absolutely certain about, from the moment Richard set that card on the table, was that I was not going to let either of them watch me need help leaving. The drive to Wisteria House took 43 minutes on the route I always took. Out of Savannah's historic district, past the marshes where the light sits flat and silver in the early afternoon, through the long stretch of two-lane road lined with live oaks that always made me feel, somewhere around the 3rd mile, like I was traveling backward in time as much as forward in space. I hadn't been to the house in almost 2 years. Life with Edward had been full and settled and urban in its rhythms, and Wisteria House had existed. Those years, in the particular way that things you love but don't currently need exist. Present at the edges of your awareness, unchanged in your imagination, waiting. I turned onto the gravel drive and stopped the car about halfway up. The house sat at the end of the drive the way it always had, the way it had sat at the end of that drive for 140 years. 4 stories of Italianate architecture, gone beautifully, slightly wildly to seed. The kind of building that looks, in certain lights, less like a structure someone built and more like something that grew there, as natural to the Georgia landscape as the live oaks arching over the drive and the wisteria that gave it its name and that had, in my absence, apparently decided to make a serious territorial claim on the East Wing's 2nd floor balcony. I sat in the car for a long moment looking at it. I hadn't cried since the night of the funeral, which wasn't stoicism so much as the particular numbness that settles in when grief is too large to process all at once and your body makes the sensible decision to parcel it out in manageable pieces. But sitting there on that gravel drive, looking at the house my great-grandmother had kept through the Depression by renting out every room but the kitchen, that my grandmother had filled with books and music, and the particular chaos of a woman who believed that a house's job was to be lived in rather than maintained, that my mother had brought me to every summer of my childhood as a kind of secular pilgrimage. Looking at all of that, at 140 years of women in my family who had held on to something and passed it forward, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since Thursday morning. I got out of the car and stood on the gravel in the late afternoon quiet, listening to the particular silence of Wisteria House. Not empty silence, never that, but the full, layered silence of a place that has held a great deal of living and still carries the weight of it. "I'm back," I said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. The wisteria on the east balcony moved slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel from where I was standing. I took it as an answer. The inside was dusty but structurally sound. I'd had a caretaker, Mrs. Patton, coming in monthly for years, a woman in her 70s who'd known my mother and treated the maintenance of Wisteria House with the solemn dedication of someone guarding something genuinely important. The furniture was covered in white sheets the way furniture in old houses always is, giving every room the slightly ghostly quality of a place mid-transformation, waiting for someone to pull the sheets back and remind it what it was for. I started in the kitchen, because kitchens are where I've always started when I'm putting a life back together. Get the coffee working. Get the basics functional. Let the rest of the house come back to itself gradually rather than all at once. I found the old percolator my grandmother had used, still in its cabinet, still functional, in the stubborn way of things built before planned obsolescence, was an acceptable design philosophy, and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back garden, which had gone considerably wilder than I remembered, and would need serious attention come spring. I slept that first night in my grandmother's bedroom, in her iron bed with the mattress I'd replaced 3 years prior when it had finally given out from decades of use. I lay in the dark listening to the house settle around me. The particular language of old structures, the creaks and sighs and small adjustments of a building that has been standing long enough to have opinions about the weather. And I felt, for the first time since Edward died, something that wasn't grief exactly, but wasn't its absence either. It was more like orientation, the particular feeling of a compass needle finding north. Not joy, not peace, just the quiet, fundamental clarity of knowing exactly where you are. I was home. Not the home I'd built with Edward, which had been real and good and was now genuinely gone. But a home nonetheless. Older, stranger, more demanding, and entirely, unconditionally mine. Whatever Richard and Diane were planning, whatever conversations they were having in offices with estate attorneys and among themselves over dinners, I was no longer present at. None of it could reach me here. This house had stood through a civil war and a depression, and 4 generations of women who'd refused to let go of it, and it was going to stand through whatever came next. I pulled my grandmother's quilt up to my chin and closed my eyes and listened to Wisteria House breathe around me in the dark. And for the first time in 29 days, I slept without dreaming. The first thing Marcus Webb said when he pulled up the drive and got out of his truck was not hello. He stood in the gravel, looked up at the facade for a long moment, took off his glasses, cleaned them carefully on his shirt, put them back on, and looked again. Then he looked at me. "Dorothy," he said, "I've been doing historic preservation work in coastal Georgia for 26 years. I have walked through 231 properties on the National Historic Register." He paused. "This is the finest privately held antebellum structure I have ever personally stood in front of." "I know," I said. "Come inside." I'd called Marcus 3 days after moving in, because the East Wing situation had moved beyond Wisteria into something that required a professional opinion and probably structural reinforcement, and because I'd been thinking, quietly, for several years about what it would mean to properly restore Wisteria House rather than simply maintain it. Edward's death had clarified something I'd been circling without landing on, that I was done circling. That whatever time I had left, I wanted to spend it on things that actually mattered. And Wisteria House had mattered to my family for 140 years, and deserved better than benign neglect, administered by a woman who was too busy living someone else's life to attend to it properly. Marcus spent 4 hours that first day. He moved through the rooms the way people who genuinely love old buildings move through them. Slowly, attentively, stopping in doorways to look at proportions, crouching to examine floor details, pressing his palm flat against walls the way a doctor might check for a fever, reading the house the way someone fluent in a language reads a text. He didn't say much while he worked, which I appreciated. Some people narrate their expertise constantly, performing their knowledge for the room. Marcus simply used his. In the front parlor, he stopped completely still for almost 2 minutes, looking at the ceiling medallion above the original chandelier mount. Plasterwork so intricate and so perfectly preserved that it stopped people the first time they saw it, the way a piece of music stops you, requiring you to simply be in it for a moment before you can do anything else. "This medallion," he finally said. "Do you know who did this? My great-great-grandmother commissioned it from an Italian craftsman who came through Savannah in 1879, I said. His name was Benedetto Araldi. There are only 4 documented examples of his residential plasterwork still intact in the entire Southeast. Marcus turned around and looked at me. "You have one of 4, he said. "I have one of 4, I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy, do you understand what you're sitting on here?" "Tell me what you think I'm sitting on," I said, because I wanted to hear it from someone outside my own understanding of it. wanted the professional dimension of what I'd always known personally. So he told me. He told me, systematically and specifically, as we moved through room after room in the late afternoon light, what Wisteria House was in the context of Georgia's architectural heritage. Not just its age, though age alone would have been significant, but the particular convergence of factors that made it genuinely rare. The original construction quality, the Araldi plasterwork, the intact heart pine floors throughout all 4 stories, the hand-forged ironwork on every balcony, the kitchen dependency still standing in the back garden with its original brick intact, the carriage house with its timber framing so sound that Marcus stood in the center of it and said, with quiet reverence, "They don't make wood like this anymore, Dorothy. This was old-growth timber when they cut it. You couldn't replicate this today for any amount of money." Then he told me what it was worth. He was careful about it. Preservation professionals always are, because value is complicated when it intersects with history, and because a number stated plainly can collapse the complexity of what a place actually means into something that sounds like a transaction. But he was also honest, because that was Marcus's primary professional quality, the thing that had built his reputation over 26 years. He told you what he saw, clearly and completely, whether you wanted to hear it or not. The number he gave me, even conservatively estimated, even accounting for the restoration costs the East Wing would require, was the kind of number that reframes a conversation entirely. I'm not going to tell you exactly what he said, because that's between me and the property assessment. What I'll tell you is that I sat down on the dusty parlor settee when he finished, not because I was surprised. I'd known Wisteria House's value in broad terms for years, had the estate assessments my grandmother had commissioned and my mother had updated, and I had updated after her. But because hearing it said out loud, in the context of the month I'd just had, sitting in this house I'd been driven to like a woman with nothing, hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. Richard had handed me a moving company's business card 3 days after burying his father. He had looked at a 69-year-old widow across a kitchen table and seen someone he needed to manage, to relocate, to reduce to a stipend and a suitable property in the area. He had seen, in other words, exactly what he'd always seen when he looked at me. A woman of no particular consequence, tolerated for 18 years out of filial obligation, finally available to be disposed of efficiently. And the entire time, 43 minutes down a 2-lane road lined with live oaks, there had been this. 4 stories of irreplaceable Georgia history, Benedetto Araldi's plasterwork, untouched above the original chandelier mount, heart pine floors that had held 140 years of a family's life, a carriage house built from timber that couldn't be replicated for any amount of money. Mine, entirely, unconditionally, legally, historically mine. My name on the deed. My family's name in the historical record. My great-great-grandmother's decision preserved in the ironwork, on every balcony of a building that was, by Marcus Webb's professional assessment, one of the finest, privately held historic structures in the state of Georgia. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked, watching me from across the parlor with the careful attention of a man who'd delivered significant news before and knew what it sometimes did to people. "I'm perfectly all right," I said. And then, because something in the moment required it, because I was sitting in my grandmother's parlor in the house that 4 generations of women in my family had refused to let go of, because I had just spent 30 days being treated like a woman who had nowhere to go and nothing to show for 69 years of living, I laughed. Not bitterly, not triumphantly, just the full, genuine, slightly overwhelmed laugh of a person who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long walk and can't quite believe they made it. Marcus, after a moment, laughed too. He didn't know why exactly, but I think the room required it. "So," he said when we'd both settled, "tell me what you want to do with it." I looked around the parlor, at the dusty settee, at the sheeted furniture, at the Araldi medallion catching the last of the afternoon light above us, at the windows looking out over grounds that had gone wild and needed attention, and were still, underneath the wildness, exactly what they'd always been. I want to bring it back, I said. All of it, the way it was meant to be. I want to do it properly, with the right people, and I want it documented so that what's here is preserved for the next 140 years, not just the next decade. I paused, and I want to do it now. I'm done waiting. Marcus pulled out his notebook. Then let's start, he said. The restoration project took on a life of its own within the first month, the way significant undertakings do when the right people are involved, and the material is genuinely worth the effort. Marcus brought in a team, a structural engineer who specialized in antebellum foundations, a plasterwork conservator from Atlanta who'd worked on 3 other Araldi pieces and went visibly pale with excitement when she stood under the parlor medallion for the first time, a landscape architect who took one look at the backgrounds and immediately started talking about what was underneath the overgrowth in a tone that suggested she was already in love. They moved through Wisteria House with the particular focused energy of people who understood they were working on something that mattered, and the house responded the way old houses respond to serious attention. By revealing itself, gradually and generously, layer by layer. The East Wing, once the wisteria was carefully removed and the structural damage properly assessed, turned out to be sounder than Marcus had initially feared. The ironwork on the balconies, cleaned and examined properly, for the first time in years, bore a maker's mark that the conservator identified as significant enough to warrant a separate documentation project. The kitchen dependency in the back garden contained, beneath 40 years of accumulated storage, an intact hearth and bake oven that the landscape architect declared the most complete example of a working plantation. Kitchen dependency I have personally encountered in 20 years of practice. I spent my days moving through a house in the process of remembering what it was, and I found, to my own surprise, that grief and restoration were not incompatible companions. Edward had known about Wisteria House. He had stood on this porch and taken my hand and said he'd spend a long time finding out about me. Bringing the house back felt, in ways I hadn't anticipated, like a conversation with him that hadn't ended, like finishing something we'd both always meant to get to. I didn't think about Richard and Diane. I want to be honest about that. I didn't think about them deliberately, wasn't planning anything, wasn't waiting for anything. I was simply doing the thing I'd decided to do, in the place I'd decided to do it, for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them. Which is why, when it happened entirely by accident. Marcus had been working with the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation on the formal documentation process, a requirement for certain restoration grants we were applying for, and something Marcus considered professionally non-negotiable, regardless of the funding question. Part of that process involved a feature in the Trust's quarterly publication, a well-regarded journal that circulated among preservation professionals, architectural historians, and the broader community of people in Georgia who cared about historic buildings. The feature ran in the November issue. 2 pages beautifully photographed, the facade in morning light, the Araldi medallion, the carriage house timber framing, the kitchen dependency hearth. A short piece about the property's history and the restoration project, written by Marcus with his characteristic precision. My name in the second paragraph, identified as the property's owner and the 4th generation of my family to hold it. I'd approved the piece, of course. I'd looked at the photographs and thought they were beautiful and felt the particular pride of someone watching something they love be seen clearly for the first time in years. I hadn't thought about who else might read it. I should have anticipated it, perhaps. Savannah is not a large city, and its historic preservation community overlaps, inevitably, with its legal and financial communities in the way that all of a small city's professional circles eventually overlap. Richard moved in those circles. He subscribed to exactly the kinds of publications that cross-referenced with the Trust's journal. He had, additionally, spent the better part of 2 months managing Edward's estate with an attorney whose office received the Trust's quarterly publication as a matter of professional routine. I found out how he learned about it later, from Marcus, who'd had an unexpected phone call from a man identifying himself as Edward Calloway's son, asking a series of questions about the Wisteria House project that Marcus had answered honestly and professionally, and then called me about immediately afterward. He seemed, Marcus said carefully, surprised. I imagine he did, I said. He asked how long you'd owned the property. What did you tell him? The truth, Marcus said, that the deed records show continuous family ownership going back to 1879 and that you'd inherited it from your mother in 1998. A pause. He was quiet for a long time after that. I imagine he was, I said again. What I learned later, from a source I'll leave unnamed, was that Richard had called Diane within an hour of hanging up with Marcus, and that Diane had then spent the better part of an afternoon doing the kind of research that the internet makes available to anyone willing to sit down and actually look. Property records, the Trust's publication archive, the historical designation documents, the assessed value that the county had on file for a property of Wisteria House's classification and condition. I don't know exactly what number Diane arrived at, but I know from what happened next that it was sufficient to change something fundamental in both of their calculations, to transform, in whatever conversation they had that afternoon, the settled, comfortable certainty that had been sitting in Richard's folded hands on my kitchen table 2 months earlier into something considerably less certain. They called me the following Tuesday. Not Richard alone, not Diane alone, both of them, together, on a single call, which told me they'd discussed not just what to say, but how to say it, which meant the conversation had been prepared, rather than spontaneous, which meant, in turn, that they were more unsettled than either of them wanted me to know. Dorothy, Richard said, in a tone I hadn't heard from him in 18 years of knowing him. Careful, measured, stripped of the particular easy confidence that had always underwritten every conversation we'd ever had. We were hoping we might come and see you. When you have time. I looked out the parlor window at the grounds, where the landscape architect's team was beginning the careful work of uncovering what was underneath 40 years of overgrowth. Moving with the patience of people who understood that what they were looking for was already there, waiting. Of course, I said. Saturday works well. Come in the afternoon. A pause. Thank you, Dorothy. Of course, I said again, and hung up, and stood for a moment in the parlor, with the afternoon light coming through windows that had just been properly cleaned for the first time in years. Making the room look, as Marcus had said it would once we got the glass right, exactly the way it was supposed to look. Then I went to find Mrs. Patton, who was in the kitchen dependency, cataloging the contents of the original larder with the thoroughness of a woman who took inventory seriously, and I asked her if she'd be willing to bake something for Saturday afternoon. Something good? She asked, without looking up from her clipboard. Something that takes time to make properly, I said. The kind of thing that fills the house while it's baking. She looked up at me then, and something in her expression told me she understood exactly what I was asking for without my having to explain it. I'll make the lane cake, she said. Your grandmother's recipe. Perfect, I said. I went back to the parlor, sat down in the chair by the window, and picked up the book I'd been reading. Outside, the landscape architect's team worked steadily through the overgrowth, uncovering, inch by careful inch, the garden that had always been there underneath. Saturday, I thought. Plenty of time. They arrived at 2:15 on Saturday, 15 minutes late, which told me they'd sat in the car at the end of the drive for a while before coming up. I was on the front porch when Richard's car turned onto the gravel, sitting in the same chair I'd been sitting in the morning I'd first come back. Sweet tea in hand, the Lane cake cooling in the kitchen behind me, and the smell of it still warm in the air. I watched them come up the drive the way I'd watched them for 18 years, carefully, completely, without performing anything for the benefit of the watching. Richard's face through the windshield was doing the thing I'd seen it do in the distance on that first return afternoon, the recalibration, the quiet dismantling of a picture he'd been carrying. Up close, stopped on the gravel 15 feet from the porch. It was more specific than that. It was the face of a man encountering for the first time the full dimensions of something he'd spent 18 years deliberately not looking at. Diane got out of the passenger side and stood in the gravel looking up at the facade, and for a long moment she simply didn't move. She was wearing the kind of careful, composed expression she wore when she was working hard to manage what her face was doing, and it was working less well than usual. "Dorothy," Richard said, coming up the porch steps with his hand extended, "thank you for having us." "Of course," I said, shaking his hand. "Come inside." I took them through the house the way the house wanted to be experienced, starting in the entrance hall, where the original heart pine floors had just been refinished and caught the afternoon light in a way that stopped people. Then through to the front parlor with the Araldi medallion, then back through the dining room with its intact original plasterwork cornice, then upstairs through rooms that were still mid-restoration but already beginning to show what they would be, and finally out through the back gallery to the grounds, where the landscape architect's work had already begun to reveal the original garden structure underneath the overgrowth, formal paths, an original boxwood parterre, a cutting garden that misses. Patton had told me her mother had described from memory as the most beautiful thing in Savannah in its day. I didn't narrate, I didn't explain. I let the house make its own argument, the way houses that have been standing for 140 years and are properly attended to always make their own argument, simply by being fully, completely what they are, without apology or embellishment. Richard was quiet through most of it. Diane asked questions, careful ones, professional ones, the questions of someone trying to establish the specific dimensions of what she was looking at rather than simply experiencing it. How long had my family owned it? When had it been placed on the National Historic Register? What the restoration project involved? How long it was expected to take? I answered everything directly and completely without offering more than was asked. It was in the back gallery, looking out over the grounds in the late afternoon light, that Richard finally said the thing I'd been waiting for him to find his way to since they'd pulled up the drive. "I didn't know about this," he said. Not an apology, not yet, just a statement of fact, offered in a tone that was the closest I'd heard from him to something unguarded. "No," I said. "You didn't." "Edward knew?" Edward knew. He was quiet for a moment, processing that, the specific fact that his father had known for 18 years and had not told him. I watched him work through what that meant, and I let him work through it because it was his to work through, and not mine to manage. "He never mentioned it," Richard said. "It wasn't his to mention," I said. "It's mine. It's always been mine." Edward understood that. Diane turned from the railing to look at me, and something in her expression had shifted from the careful professional composure she'd maintained through the tour into something more raw, less managed. "How long have you owned it?" "I inherited it from my mother in 1998, I said. "She inherited it from my grandmother in 1974. My great-grandmother inherited it from her mother in 1931, during the Depression, when my great-great-grandmother refused to sell it despite every reasonable financial argument for doing so. I paused. The women in my family have never been particularly interested in the reasonable financial arguments for letting go of things that matter. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across her face that I hadn't seen there before. Not shame exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a reckoning, the particular expression of a person starting to understand that they've been operating with an incomplete picture for a very long time. "Dorothy," she started. "Come have some tea," I said. "Mrs. Patton made the Lane cake. It needs to be eaten while it's still today." I took them back through the house to the dining room, where Mrs. Patton had set the table with my grandmother's china, the good set. The one that came out for occasions that warranted it. And the Lane cake on its original stand, which had been in the family as long as the recipe. And the late afternoon light coming through windows that had just been properly cleaned, filling the room with exactly the quality of light this room had been built to hold. We sat down together, the three of us, at a table that had held 4 generations of my family's significant moments. And I poured the tea myself and cut the cake myself and set a piece in front of each of them without asking whether they wanted it. Richard looked at his plate, then at the room, then at me. Whatever he'd come here prepared to say, whatever conversation he and Diane had rehearsed in the car at the end of the drive, seemed to have rearranged itself into something different in the face of the actual afternoon. "The house is extraordinary," he said finally. It was the most honest thing I'd heard him say in 18 years of knowing him. "Yes," I agreed. "It is." "I owe you an apology," he said then, and I think it surprised him slightly to hear himself say it. The way honest things sometimes surprise us when they come out before we've finished deciding to say them. For the way things were handled, after Dad. I looked at him across my grandmother's table, in my grandmother's china, in the house that 4 generations of women in my family had refused to let go of, and I thought about a business card, and 30 days, and a subordinate clause in a eulogy, and about 18 years of rearranged photographs and loaded compliments, and the word practical delivered with a smile. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I mean that." "But," he said, because he'd always been perceptive when he chose to be. "But an apology for the 30 days is the easy part," I said. "The harder thing, the thing that would actually mean something, is understanding where the 30 days came from. Not the logistics of it, the thinking behind it. What you believed about me that made handing me a moving company's card 3 days after your father's funeral seem like the appropriate thing to do." The dining room was very quiet. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was going gold over the grounds. Diane set down her fork. "We thought," she started, and then stopped. "I know what you thought," I said, not unkindly. "You thought I was someone who'd attached herself to your father's life because she had nothing of her own. Someone who needed managing rather than knowing. Someone whose presence in your family was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be seen." I looked at both of them evenly. "You were wrong, but I'd like you to think about why you were so certain you were right for so long, without ever once asking me a single question that might have told you otherwise." Neither of them answered. The Lane cake sat in the center of the table, sweet and fragrant and patient, the way things made from good recipes in good kitchens in houses that have stood long enough tend to be. "Eat your cake," I said. "It's your grandmother's recipe too, in a way. Your father loved it. I made it every Christmas for 18 years. Richard looked down at his plate, and something in his face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with real estate or estate attorneys or the assessed value of a historic property on the National Historic Register. He picked up his fork. They stayed for 2 hours. Not the 30-minute visit I'd half expected, The kind where people come to see what they need to see and leave once they've recalibrated their position. They stayed, and the staying had a different quality than the arrival, looser and less managed, the way people sometimes become when a place takes the performance out of them before they've noticed it happening. Diane asked about the plasterwork conservator, about the restoration timeline, about the landscape architect's assessment of the back garden. The questions started as the careful, professional kind she'd been asking during the tour, and somewhere in the second cup of tea shifted into something more genuinely curious. The questions of a person who was actually interested rather than one gathering information for a purpose. Richard was quieter, but present in a way he rarely had been in 18 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, not performing his own composure, not managing the room, just sitting at the table in the late afternoon with his father's wife in a house his father had known about and loved, eating Lane cake and not saying very much, and occasionally looking around the dining room with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. It looked, I thought, a little like grief. Real grief, not the managed kind he'd brought to the funeral. I let the afternoon be what it was. I didn't push, didn't press the harder conversation I'd opened before the cake, didn't require anything from either of them beyond what they were already offering. Some conversations need to be started and then left alone for a while, given room to work on people at their own pace rather than yours. When they finally stood to leave, we walked out to the front porch, together in the early evening, quiet, the grounds going soft and shadowy in the dusk, the live oaks along the drive settling into their nighttime shapes. Diane stopped at the top of the porch steps and turned to look at the house one more time. The full facade in the evening light, the ironwork balconies, the wisteria on the east wing that Marcus's team had carefully removed and would, in the spring, be trained back up the proper trellis structures they were building to support it. Mom used to say that a house tells you what it needs, she said quietly, to no one in particular. She meant their house, the one they grew up in. But I think she'd have meant this one, too. It was the first time in 18 years Diane had said anything in my presence that included me in some version of her family's story, rather than placing me outside it. I don't think she entirely noticed she'd done it. She sounds like she was perceptive, I said. Diane looked at me. She was. A pause. I think she would have. I don't know. I think she might have seen you more clearly than we did. She was good at that. I didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't overload the moment, and the moment was already carrying more than it was used to. Richard shook my hand at the bottom of the porch steps, and this time the handshake was different. Not the firm, performative grip of someone establishing a position, but something more ordinary, more human. "Dorothy," he said, "I'd like to. I think we should talk more. About Dad. About the estate, yes, but also just about him. There are things I think you know about the last 18 years of his life that I don't, and I think I've been treating that as something to protect myself from rather than something worth knowing." I looked at him steadily, at this man with his father's eyes who had spent 18 years looking at me and seeing a problem to be solved. "I'd be willing to do that," I said, "on certain terms." He nodded, expecting this. "What terms?" "That we talk honestly," I said. Not managed honestly. Not the version of honesty that's arranged to protect everyone's comfort. Actually, honestly. About what happened, what you believed, why you believed it, what it cost. I paused. "I'm not interested in resolution for its own sake, Richard. I'm not going to sit across from you and tell you everything's fine because it's easier than sitting with what's actually true. I've spent 69 years being more interested in what's actually true than in what's comfortable, and I'm not going to stop now." He was quiet for a moment. "That seems fair," he said. "It is fair," I said. "It's the only version of a relationship I know how to have." Your father understood that about me from the beginning, which is probably why we worked.
Something moved across face at that, not pain exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has just heard something.
That reorients their understanding of someone they thought they knew well. He loved you, Richard said. It came out simply, directly, without the careful management his sentences usually carried, and I understood that it cost him something to say it. Not because it wasn't true, but because saying it out loud required him to acknowledge that the love was real, that the marriage was real, that the woman standing on this porch was not a placeholder his father had settled for, but a person his father had genuinely, completely chosen. Yes, I said. He did, and I loved him. For 18 years, clearly and without reservation, and I'll thank you to let that stand as the truth of what it was, whatever else gets sorted out between us. Diane, standing a few steps back, made a sound that might have been the beginning of something she decided not to finish. I didn't look at her directly, because some moments require being allowed to resolve themselves without witnesses pressing in too closely. They walked to the car in the dusk, and I stood on the porch and watched them go, the way I'd stood on this porch as a child watching people leave, feeling the particular quality of the house's presence at my back. Solid, patient, neither urgent nor indifferent, simply there. Richard's car reached the end of the drive and turned onto the road, the taillights disappearing between the live oaks, and the gravel settled back into its evening stillness, and the crickets took up again where they'd paused during the sound of the engine, and the house breathed out around me the way old houses breathe when they've been properly inhabited, with the slow, satisfied exhalation of something fulfilling its purpose. I went back inside and collected the tea things myself, carrying them through the house to the kitchen. In the evening quiet, the heart pine floors warm under my feet, the Araldi medallion catching the last light through the parlor windows as I passed. Mrs. Patton had left a note on the kitchen counter. Leftover cake in the tin. Don't eat it all tonight. P. I smiled at that and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back garden in the dusk, the boxwood parterre beginning to emerge from its overgrowth, the kitchen dependency solid against the evening sky, the cutting garden that would be by next spring something worth seeing again. Whatever came next with Richard and Diane, the honest conversations, the difficult reckonings, the slow and imperfect work of building something real out of the wreckage of what had been false, none of it was going to be simple, and none of it was going to be quick, and some of it might not work at all. But it was going to be honest, and after 69 years of understanding that honesty was always, in the long run, cheaper than the alternative, I was willing to find out where it led. I poured my tea, cut a thin slice of Lane cake despite Mrs. Patton's instructions, and sat down at the kitchen table in my grandmother's house, in my mother's house, in my house, and let the evening come in around me. I've been thinking in the months since that Saturday afternoon about what it actually means to be invisible. Not invisible in the dramatic sense, not erased, not silenced, not denied. Invisible in the quieter, more ordinary sense that I think most women of a certain age understand without needing it explained. The particular invisibility of being present in a room and having everyone in that room feel entirely comfortable deciding, without asking, exactly what you are and what you're worth, and how much space you're entitled to take up. It happens gradually, invisibility of that kind. It doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, the way Richard's certainty about me accumulated. One assumption stacked on another, each one small enough to dismiss individually, the whole structure so settled by the time anyone thinks to examine it, that it seems like simply the way things are, rather than a series of choices that could have gone differently. I've thought about the specific shape of what Richard and Diane assumed about me, And I've tried to be honest with myself about the ways I made it easy for them. I didn't correct their assumptions. I didn't offer information they hadn't asked for. I lived for 18 years inside the version of myself that existed in their father's house. The second wife, the quiet presence, the woman who cooked Sunday dinners and kept her own counsel and never made anyone uncomfortable by requiring them to actually know her. I made that choice deliberately, and I made it for reasons that still seem largely sound to me. I wasn't interested in performing my credentials for people who hadn't earned the right to see them. I wasn't going to wave Wisteria House like a flag to establish my legitimacy in a family that should have accepted me on simpler grounds than property value. I believe, and have always believed, that people who can only respect you once they understand what you're worth in material terms are telling you something important about the limits of their respect. But I've also had to sit with the other side of that. The part where I let my son Adam love me exactly as I was, without reservation. Where I answered his questions, told him my stories, let him know me across the decades. And where, with Richard and Diane, I retreated behind a kind of dignity that was real, but was also, if I'm being completely honest, a form of protection. I didn't give them the chance to know me because I'd already decided they wouldn't bother. Maybe I was right. Probably, given the evidence, I was right. But I've sat with the possibility that I was also, in some small way, wrong, that closing the door before they had a chance to knock on it was its own kind of choice, with its own consequences, and that some of what felt like their failure to see me was partly my decision not to be seen. I don't say that to take responsibility for Richard's business card or Diane's loaded compliments or 18 years of rearranged photographs. Those were their choices, made from their assumptions, and the assumptions were theirs to examine and correct, not mine to manage for them. But I think the full truth is always more complicated than the clean version, and I've spent 69 years preferring the full truth. What I've come to believe, sitting in Wisteria House, watching it become again what it always was underneath the years of neglect, is something about the relationship between visibility and value. About the particular damage done in families and in broader culture by the habit of assessing people's worth through the visible markers of it, the titles, the addresses, the square footage, the name in the right subordinate clause of the right professional document, rather than through the slower, harder work of actually knowing them. Richard handed me a moving company's card because he'd looked at a 69-year-old widow and performed a rapid, confident assessment based on everything he could see, and everything he could see told him she had nothing. He wasn't uniquely cruel in that assessment. He was doing what our culture trains us to do, reading the available signals, drawing the available conclusions, moving efficiently toward the available outcome. What he hadn't accounted for was everything he couldn't see, which is, I think, always the most important thing. I think about this in the context of the women in my family who held on to Wisteria House across 140 years. My great-great-grandmother, who refused to sell during the worst economic crisis of the century. My grandmother, who filled it with books and music, and gave it back its life after decades of careful maintenance. My mother, who brought me here every summer and taught me, without using those words, that some things are worth holding on to, not because of what they're worth, but because of what they mean. None of those women would have been immediately visible as significant by Richard's standards. None of them held corporate titles, or sat on boards, or had their names in publication features before the Restoration Project. They were simply women who understood what they had and held on to it and passed it forward. That's not nothing. I'd argue it's almost everything. I think, too, about the broader reality of what happens to women after they become widows in this country, the particular vulnerability of a status that combines grief with legal complexity, with the sudden exposure to family members whose relationship to you has, until that moment, been mediated entirely by the person who is now gone. The estate attorneys, the business cards, the 30-day notices, the comfortable certainty of people who have decided, in the absence of the person who stood between you and them, that the balance of power has shifted permanently in their direction. It happens everywhere. In houses much plainer than wisteria, to women with much less to fall back on. Women who don't have a gravel drive to drive up, a 140-year-old house to sit in, 4 generations of stubbornness behind them. Women who take the 30 days and find the suitable property and accept the stipend because there is no other option available to them. I was lucky. I want to say that plainly, without false modesty and without diminishing the luck. I was lucky in the specific, concrete way of a woman who happened to have an asset that happened to be visible enough, once a magazine feature was published, to force a recalibration in the people who'd underestimated her. Not every woman gets that. Most don't, and the injustice of the situation isn't changed by the fact that it was eventually corrected in my particular case. It's simply interrupted, for me, while it continues unchanged for the women who don't have a wisteria house waiting at the end of a gravel drive. That's the thing I keep coming back to, in the quiet evenings in my grandmother's parlor, with the Araldi medallion catching whatever light is available and the house breathing steadily around me. It shouldn't require a historic mansion to make a widow visible. It shouldn't require a board seat or a capital deployment or a publication feature or any of the other visible markers of consequence that our culture has decided are the legitimate evidence of a person's worth. It should only require being a person, being present, being, for 69 years, exactly who you are, consistently, completely, without apology. That should be enough. And in my experience, it eventually is. It just sometimes takes a gravel drive and a Saturday afternoon and a lane cake to make the people who needed to see it finally look up from whatever they were so busy calculating. Wisteria House opened to its first visitors in the spring, not as a museum, not as a bed and breakfast. I've had both suggested, and declined both, for reasons that feel obvious to me and that I won't belabor. It opened as a private residence that hosts, twice a year, a Preservation Society event for the Georgia Trust's members and partners. The kind of gathering that brings people who love old buildings into contact with one of the finest examples of what they love. And that generates, as a practical matter, the kind of documentation and attention that protects a place like this for the next generation and the one after that. Marcus stood in the front parlor at the first event, watching people stop under the Araldi medallion the way he'd stopped theirs himself that first afternoon. And I watched him watching them, and we didn't say anything to each other, because nothing needed to be said. The east wing balcony held wisteria again by April. Properly trained this time on the trellis structures Marcus's team had built over the winter, cascading down the ironwork in exactly the way my grandmother had described it from her own childhood, the way her mother had described it before her. Standing in the back garden on the morning, it fully bloomed, looking up at 140 years of stubbornness rendered in purple and green against old brick. I understood something about continuity that I'd known intellectually for years, but hadn't felt in my body until that moment. Some things are worth the holding. Richard and I have had 3 of the honest conversations I asked for. They haven't been easy, and they haven't been complete, and I don't expect them to become either of those things quickly. But they've been real, which is what I asked for, and real is worth considerably more than easy in my experience. He came alone the last time, without Diane, and we sat in the back gallery for 2 hours talking about Edward. Not the estate, not the house, not any of the logistical residue of a life concluded, but Edward himself, the man, the father, the husband. What he'd been like before he was widowed. what the last years had looked like from the inside of the marriage rather than the outside of it. Richard cried, once, briefly, and didn't apologize for it. I considered that significant progress. Diane sent me a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, 3 pages, which told me she'd thought carefully about what she wanted to say before she said it. It wasn't a perfect letter. There were places where the honesty got careful again, where old habits of self-protection reasserted themselves. But it was genuine in its core, and I wrote back. And we've been corresponding since in the particular, slightly old-fashioned way of 2 people who've discovered that they communicate better in writing than in person, which is its own kind of truth about both of us. I don't know what will become to each other, the 3 of us, over the years remaining. I've stopped trying to know that in advance, which is its own kind of progress for a woman who spent 30 years in a profession that required projecting outcomes from available data. Some things can't be projected. Some things can only be lived. What I know is this. I am in my grandmother's house, in the town where 4 generations of women in my family chose to stay, doing work that matters to me in a place that has mattered to people I loved for longer than I've been alive. I wake up in the iron bed in the morning and listen to the house settle around me. And I make coffee in the kitchen with the original hearth that the landscape architect said was the most complete example she'd personally encountered. And I sit at the table my grandmother sat at and look out at the garden that's coming back to itself, inch by careful inch. And I think about all the women who sat in this same kitchen before me, holding on to something worth holding. Edward would have loved this. I know that as certainly as I know anything. He would have sat on the front porch in the evening and looked out at the live oaks and said something quiet and precise about what the light was doing. And I would have agreed with him, and we would have been content. I carry that with me, the specific weight of a love that was real, into whatever comes next. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt like something you needed to hear today, I'd love for you to tell me in the comments what it was. Subscribe if you're new here, because there are more of these, and some of them are even longer. And if you've ever held on to something worth holding when everyone around you was telling you to let go, tell me about it. I read every comment, and I mean that, and I'm genuinely curious about what you're holding on to.